You ever get that feeling when you're sitting across from someone, and although they're smiling, and although they're saying all the right things, something in your gut clenches up like a warning bell? You nod, you smile back, but your body is already 5 steps ahead, whispering that something is off. You can't explain it with logic, and you might even try to dismiss it, because on paper, this person is perfect. Charming, kind, agreeable, successful. And yet, you leave the room feeling like your energy was siphoned, like something about the exchange was staged. That's your unconscious at work. And Carl Jung, yes, that Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who opened up the world of archetypes, the shadow, the persona, and the unconscious, would say that your psyche just brushed up against something that didn't align, something hidden behind the mask that person wore so effortlessly. And the truth is, Jung didn't just give us language for inner discovery, he gave us warning signs. He offered tools for discerning the hidden motives behind the people we meet every day. And if we pay attention, we can see through the masks of the 6 types of people we should never trust, not because they're always evil, but because their lack of self-awareness, or their manipulation, or their arrested development makes them dangerous in ways that drain us, derail us, and sometimes even damage our sense of self. Now let's start with the first kind of person, the one that's often the hardest to spot because they were the brightest mask, the charismatic, confident, endlessly self-assured person who always seems to know exactly what to say, how to say it, and when to flash that perfect smile. You might meet them at work, or on a date, or even at a family event. They radiate certainty. But what they're really radiating is a carefully constructed persona, a masking described as the social self, the front we wear to interact with the world. For this person, though, the persona isn't just a tool, it's all there is. The shadow, the raw, vulnerable, anxious, or even angry parts of them, has been locked in the basement of their psyche for so long that they don't even know it exists. So they build relationships based on admiration, not connection. They need you to mirror back their magnificence. But the moment you stop admiring them, when you question their judgment, when you fail to give them your full emotional attention, they'll either lash out or withdraw. You see, Jung believed that the shadow always leaks. No matter how polished the mask, the repressed parts find a way out. So this person begins to unconsciously project. Suddenly, you're the one being difficult. You're the one who's jealous or negative. What's happening is simple, they're disowning their own feelings and handing them to you. And if you're not careful, you'll carry them. You'll start second-guessing yourself, wondering if you really are too critical or not supportive enough. You're not. You've just entered someone else's psychological theater. But the plot thickens when the person you're dealing with isn't grandiose, but adaptable. Smooth. Charming, yes, but in a different way. This second kind of person doesn't need to be adored, they need to be liked by everyone, in every room. And to do that, they'll become whoever you need them to be. Jung would say their persona is like water, it takes the shape of any container. They'll mirror your preferences, nod at your opinions, and echo your values. You'll feel an eerie connection, as if you've known them forever. But the connection is hollow, because it's a performance. Underneath the surface is not a unified self, but an empty one. This person has buried their shadow so deeply they've lost all sense of who they actually are. So they borrow identities. And while they may not lash out like the narcissist when you challenge them, they'll quietly shift allegiances, or share your secrets with others, or play different roles in different social settings, until one day you realize they've been using your vulnerability as a currency. Not out of malice, but out of habit. Jung believed that projection was often unconscious, and in this case, the person doesn't know they're doing harm. But the harm is real. Because while they're blending in, you're getting pulled into something dishonest. And dishonesty, even when subtle, eats away at trust. And trust is everything when you encounter the third type of person, the one who thrives on emotional volatility. They enter your life like a thunderstorm. You might meet them during a crisis, or they might create one just to get your attention. Jung described the collective unconscious as the vast ocean of shared human emotion and experience, and this person swims in it constantly, often drowning and pulling others down with them. They're not bad people. In fact, they're often incredibly vulnerable, and sometimes deeply wounded. But because they haven't made peace with their own inner chaos, they externalize it. They seek intensity, not intimacy. They don't want connection unless it comes with adrenaline. So their relationships are dramatic, full of ups and downs, declarations of loyalty followed by betrayals, closeness followed by ghosting. One day you're the hero, the next you're the villain. What's happening is pure projection. Jung believed that when someone hasn't integrated their shadow, they see it everywhere else. So if this person feels shame, they'll accuse you of judging them. If they feel anger, they'll tell others you're abusive. The cycle becomes toxic quickly, and the more empathy you offer, the more they take. Because what they really need isn't attention, it's containment. They need someone to witness their emotions without being consumed by them. But if you try to offer that kind of support, they'll often reject it, because they're addicted to reaction, not reflection. And you can't fix someone's inner world if they're committed to making it your responsibility. But then, just when you think you've learned to spot the chaos, you meet the fourth type, the cold, calculating, rational person who never loses control. In fact, they pride themselves on it. They speak with precision. They never raise their voice. They make decisions based on facts, not feelings. And at first, you admire them. There's a kind of power in that composure. You might even feel safe around it, like finally you found someone grounded, someone immune to drama. But the danger here is subtler. Jung would call it the inflation of the thinking function, the dominance of intellect at the expense of emotional truth. This person isn't free of emotion, they've simply exiled it. Their shadow is full of repressed vulnerability, tenderness, and fear. But rather than acknowledge these human realities, they reduce everything to logic. They analyze instead of empathize. And when you come to them with a real feeling, a moment of insecurity, confusion, even joy, they'll listen, yes, but with distance. You'll feel a coolness that's hard to name, like they're present but not available. And if you ever challenge their authority, their need to be right, they'll shut down or cut you off entirely. Because their sense of self is tied not to connection, but to control. And control, in Jungian terms, is often the ego's last stand against the unconscious. When you push past that wall, you threaten the very identity they've built. So they retreat. And you're left wondering why someone so reasonable could feel so unreachable. And that leads us to perhaps the most familiar and culturally accepted of the six, the martyr. The self-sacrificing, endlessly giving person who seems to put everyone else first. They show up. They remember your birthday. They offer help before you ask. And they never complain, until one day, they do. And then you hear all the quiet resentment that's been building up like steam in a sealed pot. Jung warned us about the danger of over-identifying with the archetype of the good person. Because goodness, when it's disconnected from authenticity, becomes a trap. The martyr often builds their identity around service because deep down, they don't believe they're worthy of love without it. They bury their anger, their exhaustion, their desires, until the shadow takes over. And when it does, it emerges not as honest frustration, but as guilt-tripping, passive aggression, or emotional withdrawal. Suddenly, you're the one being told you're selfish, ungrateful, inattentive. But what's really happening is that the martyr is trying to reclaim a self they've lost in the service of others. And that self is angry. Jung believed that all repression leads to imbalance. And in this case, the repression of need leads to manipulation. The tragedy is that the martyr often doesn't know they're doing it. They genuinely believe they're just being kind. But their kindness has a cost, and when you stop paying it, the bill arrives in subtle punishments. If you feel chronically indebted to someone who never seems to ask for anything, but always seems disappointed, you might be dealing with this exact dynamic. Now we arrive at the sixth kind, and this one is perhaps the most dangerous, not because they're overtly cruel, but because they operate in shadows even they can't see. This is the person who seems spiritual, reflective, psychologically aware. They might quote Jung, or reference shadow work, or talk about energy, trauma, mindfulness. They've read all the right books. They know the language. But they haven't done the work. Jung called this phenomenon spiritual inflation. When the ego identifies with the archetype of the wise one, the healer, the mystic, without actually confronting the depths of the unconscious. This person hides their insecurity behind enlightenment. They preach vulnerability but avoid their own. They talk about projection but never admit to theirs. And if you dare to question them, if you challenge their interpretation, or express a need they haven't anticipated, they'll mask their defensiveness in spiritual terms. Suddenly, your pain is low vibrational. Your feedback is ego-driven. Your disappointment is resistance to growth. What's happening is classic shadow projection. They've buried their own fear of inadequacy so deeply that they can only see it in others. And because they believe they're awakened, they don't examine their motives. Jung said that the greater the conscious light, the darker the shadow. And with this type of person, the shadow is enormous. They believe they've transcended their humanity, when in fact they've just rebranded it. And if you're not careful, you'll start doubting your own reality. Because they're not yelling or gaslighting in the usual sense, they're using spiritual language to undermine your truth. It's subtle. It's seductive. And it's incredibly destabilizing. But here's the truth that Jung returned to again and again: we are all capable of these patterns. These 6 people are not aliens. They are us, at different stages of awareness, in different modes of defense. And sometimes, the person we shouldn't trust is the one in the mirror. Because we all have a persona. We all have a shadow. We all project. And the only way out of the trap is into self-reflection. Into humility. Into a willingness to say, maybe I don't see the whole picture. Maybe my reactions aren't always about others. Maybe I've worn masks too. The goal isn't to live in suspicion of everyone else. It's to develop a kind of inner clarity, a radar that doesn't just detect deceit in others, but also in ourselves. Jung didn't offer easy answers. He didn't create a checklist for toxic people. He asked us to look inward, to track our emotional responses, to examine the archetypes that shape our behavior. And when we do, we become less reactive. We stop falling for charm, or performance, or spiritual bypassing. We begin to sense the real from the fake, not because we're judging, but because we're seeing. And once you begin to see, truly see, something irreversible happens. It's not dramatic or loud. It's subtle. You start noticing the slight hesitation in someone's voice when they agree too quickly. You catch the momentary flicker of anger behind a smile. You sense when a compliment is meant to bind, not lift. You don't need to name it, or accuse anyone. You just feel it, quietly, in your body, in the way your chest tightens, or your jaw stiffens, or your thoughts begin to cloud. That's not paranoia. That's your psyche doing its job. Jung said the unconscious sends messages to consciousness through emotion, through dream, through intuition. And the more attuned we are, the more fluently we speak that language. So the project isn't just to avoid the 6 people we shouldn't trust, it's to become someone who can sense the weather inside others, without getting caught in their storm. That requires a kind of maturity that doesn't come from reading or talking. It comes from watching yourself in the moment, when you want to impress someone, or save someone, or fix someone, or win someone. That moment is the invitation. Because behind it, there's usually a forgotten wound, or a disowned need, or a buried fear. And the moment you acknowledge it, even silently, you start to choose differently. You stop playing roles. You stop performing. And slowly, the masks fall, yours, and theirs. But let's be honest, it's not easy. Because trust is not just a logical choice, it's a nervous system state. We trust people who feel familiar. And if what's familiar is chaos, or manipulation, or absence disguised as love, then we'll keep walking toward the very people Jung warned us about. Not because we're broken, but because the psyche repeats what it hasn't healed. That's why awareness matters. Not as a weapon, but as a flashlight. So you can look at the patterns, not with blame, but with curiosity. Why did I feel so drawn to this person who only offered me fragments? Why did I ignore my intuition when it said something was off? Why did I stay quiet when my voice was shaking to speak? These questions aren't easy, but they're real. And they're the beginning of freedom. Because once you stop abandoning yourself for connection, you stop tolerating the counterfeit version of it. You stop confusing control with safety. You stop mistaking charisma for character. And you start walking a quieter, more honest path, not free of disappointment, but free of delusion. And the thing about delusion is that it rarely looks like madness. Often, it looks like politeness. Or optimism. Or loyalty. But Jung reminded us that the unconscious doesn't care about appearances. It cares about truth. And when we stay too long in false relationships, relationships built on projection, performance, or fear, we start to fragment. You feel it as fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. As doubt that affirmation can't erase. As loneliness even when you're never alone. That's the psyche saying, this is not your home. And if you listen, really listen, it will guide you back. Not necessarily away from people, but toward yourself. Because the more self-aware you become, the less tolerant you are of dynamics that dishonor that awareness. You stop explaining your needs to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop proving your worth to those who require your diminishment. You stop fixing others so you don't have to feel your own pain. And in that shift, a new kind of strength emerges, not hard, not guarded, but rooted. That rootedness is what Jung was always pointing toward. Not enlightenment. Not perfection. Integration. The ability to hold the light and the dark. To admit when we've been fooled, and to forgive ourselves without collapsing. To spot manipulation without becoming cynical. To feel our anger without becoming cruel. To remember that the shadow is not the enemy, it's the doorway. And every time we walk through it, we reclaim a piece of ourselves we once gave away. Maybe to the charismatic leader. Maybe to the emotionally unavailable lover. Maybe to the friend who made us earn their kindness. But now, we gather those pieces back. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. And that clarity becomes our compass. Not to live in fear, but to live in truth. And once you begin to live in truth, even when it's raw, even when it's uncomfortable, something else begins to shift, your energy. Not the kind of energy you feel after a cup of coffee, but something deeper, quieter, more magnetic. People sense it, even if they can't name it. Because there's a difference between someone who has nothing to prove and someone who's still trying to prove everything. And when your self-worth is no longer outsourced, when it's not waiting on approval, praise, attention, or even understanding, you move differently. You speak with more calm, even when your voice shakes. You walk away sooner, not out of anger, but out of knowing. You stop chasing closure from people who were never open in the first place. And slowly, the people who once seemed so compelling, the performers, the martyrs, the manipulators, start to lose their pull. Not because they've changed, but because you have. Jung once said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But once you make it conscious, you begin to write your own story, instead of reenacting someone else's. And what's remarkable is that this shift doesn't make you harder, it makes you softer. Because when you stop leaking energy into false connections, you have more to give to real ones. You begin to attract people who meet you with honesty, not performance. People who can sit with your truth without flinching. People who don't need to be above you, or fix you, or outshine you. They just show up, fully. And you do too. There's mutuality. There's breath. And in those moments, the ache that's lived in your bones for years, maybe decades, begins to ease. You realize you were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't hold what was real. And now that you've learned to hold it yourself, your world rearranges. You become both sanctuary and sword. Gentle, but not naive. Kind, but not permissive. Open, but not exposed. And in that posture, you start to recognize the 6 people Jung warned us about, not as villains, but as teachers. Because every manipulator you've trusted has shown you where you didn't yet trust yourself. Every overly charming mask you fell for has revealed how much you still needed approval. Every person who drained you reflected the parts of you that still thought love was something to earn. And when you see them that way, not as monsters, but as mirrors, you reclaim your power. Not all at once. Sometimes in small, trembling moments. A no when you used to say yes. A boundary where silence used to live. A breath before you respond. A pause instead of a performance. These are the signs. Not loud. Not dramatic. But revolutionary. Because they mean you're no longer living from the outside in. You're living from the inside out. And that, in Jung's language, is individuation. Becoming whole. Becoming who you were before the world told you who to be. And that wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means ownership. Ownership of your shadow, your fears, your projections, your story. It means you stop needing people to behave perfectly so that you can feel safe. You stop needing the world to validate your worth because you've made contact with the part of you that was never broken to begin with. Jung would say that this part, the self with a capital S, is the center of the psyche. Not the ego, not the persona, not the roles we play. But the still point beneath it all. And once you find that center, you become far less reactive. You see the chaos around you without joining it. You observe the manipulation without absorbing it. You hear the performance but don't mistake it for connection. And most of all, you forgive, not because they deserve it, but because you do. You forgive yourself for not knowing. For staying too long. For playing small. For betraying your own needs in the name of peace. And in that forgiveness, there's spaciousness. There's room to choose again. Differently. Consciously. And choosing consciously doesn't always mean walking away. Sometimes it means staying, but staying with your eyes open, your boundaries intact, your center unshaken. Because not everyone who triggers you is toxic. Some are simply human, flawed, complex, messy, just like you. And sometimes the real work isn't to cut people off but to meet them differently. With clarity. With compassion. With firmness rooted in love, not fear. But to do that, you have to know the difference between discomfort that stretches you and dysfunction that shrinks you. You have to know the sound of your intuition beneath the noise of your trauma. And that takes time. Patience. Stillness. Jung often emphasized the importance of solitude, not as isolation, but as sacred space. The psyche needs room to breathe. It needs silence to speak. And in that silence, we begin to hear ourselves, not the self the world expects, but the one that's been whispering all along. The one who remembers. The one who knows. And from that knowing comes discernment. A word often misunderstood. Discernment is not judgment. It is not rejection. It is not suspicion wrapped in self-righteousness. It is quiet recognition. The ability to see what is, without needing it to be something else. It's the moment you recognize that charm isn't the same as character. That intelligence doesn't equal wisdom. That someone's story of trauma doesn't excuse their pattern of harm. It's the moment you realize that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. And that love, real love, never asks you to shrink to fit someone else's fear. Jung believed that the soul's journey is not toward comfort, but toward authenticity. And sometimes authenticity burns. It costs relationships. It shatters illusions. It pulls you into grief you didn't know you were carrying. But it also sets you free. Because when you stop needing others to carry your worth, you stop chasing them. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop apologizing for taking up space, for having needs, for saying no. And what emerges is a different kind of presence. Not louder. Not more confident in the traditional sense. But more embodied. More anchored. You begin to speak from your center instead of your wounds. You begin to offer from overflow, not depletion. You begin to trust the seasons of your own unfolding, even when others don't understand. And in that trust, you become dangerous, not to others, but to every system, story, and pattern that once kept you small. This is the essence of Jung's work. Not simply to name what is wrong out there, but to illuminate what is forgotten in here. The external is always a reflection of the internal. Every person we're drawn to, especially those who hurt us, carries a clue. A lesson. A mirror. And once you start seeing life through this lens, even the pain becomes purposeful. You stop asking, why did this happen to me, and start asking, what part of me needed to see this, to feel this, to finally wake up. That shift is everything. It doesn't erase the hurt, but it transforms your relationship to it. The wound becomes initiation. The heartbreak becomes direction. The betrayal becomes a sacred no that your soul couldn't say for itself. Until now. Now, you say it. Clearly. Without rage, without collapse. Just truth. Because you've learned the difference between loyalty and self-abandonment. Between compassion and self-sacrifice. Between love and attachment. And that learning was hard-won. It came through nights you couldn't sleep. Through tears you couldn't explain. Through moments when you doubted everything, especially yourself. But you didn't stop. You kept asking. Kept listening. Kept peeling away the masks, one painful layer at a time. Until what remained wasn't shiny or impressive or performative, but real. Whole. Human. And what's real doesn't always look impressive from the outside. It's not the loudest voice in the room or the one with the most followers or the most perfectly constructed narrative. Often, what's real is quiet. Steady. It doesn't need to defend itself. It doesn't need applause. It simply is. And when you live from that place, you stop being seduced by surfaces. You stop needing stories to be beautiful, you just want them to be true. You can sit with someone's grief, not because you have the answers, but because you've made peace with your own. You can hold complexity without rushing to resolve it. You can let people be exactly who they are, without needing to fix, save, or explain them. And that's when everything changes. Because the people who were only drawn to your light, your shine, your warmth, your generosity, begin to fade away. But the people who can sit with your shadow, who meet your depth with their own, they start to appear. Not many. Maybe only one or two. But it's enough. Because that kind of connection doesn't drain you, it grounds you. It doesn't ask for more than you can give, it meets you where you are. And in those relationships, there is no performance. Only presence. Jung understood that the work of becoming whole is not a solo journey. It is deeply personal, yes. But it's also relational. Because we don't just discover ourselves in silence, we discover ourselves in how we respond to others. How we hold space for them. How we say yes. How we say no. How we show up, and how we walk away. The people we attract reflect the level of truth we're willing to live in. And if we are still tolerating dishonesty, it is because some part of us still believes we must. That love requires sacrifice. That safety comes through submission. That being chosen means becoming invisible. But we now know better. Not because a book told us. Not because a quote inspired us. But because we lived through the cost of forgetting. We felt the ache of self-betrayal. We watched ourselves disappear, bit by bit, until we didn't recognize who we were. And that pain became a turning point. A sacred rupture. The moment we stopped abandoning ourselves, even if no one else stayed. And maybe that's the quiet truth at the center of all this, not that we must never trust, but that we must learn to trust wisely. To trust slowly. To trust with our eyes open, not because we are cynical, but because we are awake. Because we know that real love honors truth, not illusion. That real friendship sees through us, not just at us. That real intimacy can hold conflict, confusion, and contradiction without collapsing. These things don't come easily. They are earned. Not through performance, but through presence. Through showing up again and again, with honesty. And the more we live in that way, the more we attract others who do too. It's not magic. It's resonance. It's coherence. When your insides match your outsides, when your values match your actions, when your boundaries match your worth, everything else begins to shift. The wrong people fall away. Not because you pushed them out, but because the frequency changed. The masks no longer work. The games no longer land. The manipulation no longer sticks. And not because the world has changed, but because you have. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate form of trust, not in them, but in you. In your ability to feel, to know, to choose. To return again and again to the center of yourself, no matter who tries to pull you away. And it's in that return, again and again, that you begin to reclaim something no one else can give you, your own authority. Not authority over others, but authority over your own inner world. You stop waiting for someone else to tell you what's true. You stop outsourcing your decisions to people who don't have to live with their consequences. You stop looking to approval as proof that you are on the right path. Because deep down, you know. You've always known. It just got buried under years of noise, of programming, of wanting to belong in places that asked you to leave parts of yourself behind. But now, with every choice to listen to that quiet voice inside you, you become more whole. You begin to see that clarity is not cruelty. That boundaries are not punishment. That saying no is not the same as being unkind. And most importantly, that you don't need a crisis to justify your truth. You're allowed to walk away from what drains you simply because you're tired. You're allowed to choose peace, even if it disappoints someone else. You're allowed to protect your energy without guilt. This is what self-trust looks like. Not certainty, not perfection, just a steady willingness to stay in relationship with your own truth, even when it's inconvenient. And this kind of inner integrity, this congruence between your values and your actions, is magnetic. It doesn't shout. It doesn't convince. It simply is. And people feel it. Not everyone will like it. Some will resent it. Because your clarity will shine a light on their confusion. Your calm will unsettle their chaos. Your presence will expose their performance. But that's not your burden to carry. You're not here to make others comfortable. You're here to be real. To be whole. To walk in truth, even if it's lonely. Even if no one claps. Even if it means letting go of the version of you that everyone liked, but that you no longer recognize. Jung would say this is the journey of the self, the movement away from the collective persona into the individuality of soul. It's not rebellion for its own sake. It's not rejection of society. It's deeper than that. It's an inward movement, a stripping away of everything that is not essentially you. And in that process, you grieve. You grieve the friendships that can't meet you where you are. You grieve the identity you built around pleasing others. You grieve the years you spent trying to be small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of love. But after the grief comes space. Space for something more honest. More enduring. More alive. And when you live from that space, when you stop negotiating your truth, you begin to see the 6 types of people you shouldn't trust, not as enemies, but as invitations. Each one shows you where you still have work to do. The manipulator asks you to examine where you still seek control. The martyr reveals where you still self-abandon. The charmer exposes your hunger for validation. The gaslighter shows you where you still doubt your inner knowing. The narcissist mirrors your disowned longing to be seen. And the perpetual victim calls forth your own suppressed helplessness. These people are not accidents. They are not just bad or toxic. They are archetypes, reflections of something deeper within the human experience. And when you stop judging them and start learning from them, you step into a different kind of freedom. A freedom that doesn't come from avoidance, but from awareness. From integration. From the quiet knowing that nothing outside of you has the power to define you, unless you hand that power over. And in this freedom, you find peace, not because the world is perfect, but because your relationship to it has changed. You no longer live in reaction to every slight, every betrayal, every manipulation. Instead, you hold your center steady, like a lighthouse in the storm. You choose when to engage and when to withdraw. You no longer carry the weight of other shadows as your own. You recognize that your journey is not about fixing the world or everyone in it. It's about healing the wound inside you that longed for something it couldn't find outside. And that healing opens space for true connection, connection that is not about need or control, but about mutual respect and presence. Carl Jung's wisdom reminds us that the path to wholeness is through courage, the courage to face our own darkness, to see ourselves honestly, to embrace the messy, complicated, imperfect human being that we are. It is a lifelong journey, full of challenges and revelations, losses and gains. But it is also the most profound gift we can give ourselves. Because when we stop trusting blindly, when we stop handing over our power to others, when we begin to trust ourselves deeply, authentically, unconditionally, that is when we become truly free. So, as you walk away from the 6 kinds of people you should never trust, remember this: it's not about building walls or becoming cynical. It's about building a foundation. A foundation of self-awareness, self-respect, and self-love. It's about honoring your own truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it means standing alone. Because on the other side of that discomfort lies a life of deeper connection, richer meaning, and more authentic joy. And that, ultimately, is the great invitation Carl Jung gives us, to step into our own light, to embrace our whole selves, and to live a life that is truly our own.